This is the amount of land we've recaptured since yesterday.
Oh, excellent.
What is the actual scale of this map, darling?
1 to 1, sir.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another video on our own devices. I'm Jean Messier, and today we're having a look at some objects I've been meaning to feature on this channel for quite some time. These are Canadian Army, or more broadly British Empire Forces engineers instruments from the First World War. And these would have been used for a wide variety of purposes, including laying out trench networks, fortifications, and other structures out on the front lines, or determining the ranges to targets for sighting in artillery. And these have been a prized feature of my personal collection for many, many years. I actually received these at the tender age of 8 as a Christmas present from one of my aunts. So as you can see, I've been collecting militaria and vintage technology for a long time. But what's even more fascinating than the history of these devices themselves and the way in which they work, which we will be going over in this video, is the very human stories that they tell, because I've actually been able to track down the military records of all the people who actually owned and used these during the First World War. So please stay tuned to the end of the video to learn about that. Anyway, without any further ado, let's jump right in and let's see what exactly we have here. So despite their age, these instruments really are in fantastic condition with relatively little wear or corrosion. And they all come in these custom-fitted leather cases manufactured by TJ Weeks & Sons Limited of Tynesfield, North Somerset. And these are also in great condition. The leather is still supple with very little cracking, and the red felt liners are all still intact. So just beautiful pieces. And the first two objects we're going to look at here are a pair of compasses. And the first one here is what's known as a Werner's pattern Mark VI prismatic compass. And this was invented in 1895 by a gentleman with the deliciously British name of Colonel William Willoughby Cole Werner. He was born in 1852. He was commissioned into the British Army in 1873. He fought in both the Egyptian campaign in 1882 and the Second Boer War before retiring in 1904 and dying in 1922. And the British Army during the First World War used a variety of different versions of this pattern of compass, the most common being the Mark VI, the Mark VII, and the Mark VIII. And this is known as a prismatic compass because of this little flip-up prism here near the lanyard loop. And this allows you to take a sighting of a distant object using the sighting hair on the clear lid here, while also being able to see the compass card. This is also why this is known as a marching compass, because it allows you to take readings on the march while keeping your eyes up, instead of having to drop the compass down every time in order to take a reading. Now, if we look down into the compass, we'll see that it is a dry compass. It is not fluid filled. It has a compass card made of mother of pearl with a nice big indicator arrow there. And that arrow, along with a matching marking on the inside of the compass lid, is composed of luminous radium paint. Though like all radium paint that has ever been manufactured, it no longer glows. Not because the radium is no longer radioactive, far from it. Radium has a half-life of 1600 years, but rather because the phosphor that converts the radiation from the radium into light has long since degraded. Though some of it is still active, if I put this under a UV light, which I can show you right now, you'll see that some of it still glows. Now, the radium paint that's actually under the bezel here is sealed off and is not much of a threat at all. Radium gives off alpha radiation, which is harmless outside the body and only becomes dangerous when you ingest or inhale it. The paint on the inside of the lid, though, I have to be a little bit careful with. I have to wash my hands after handling this, but so long as I don't, rub this little patch of paint and lick my fingers, I should be generally okay. Now let's look at some of the other features on this compass. We have a moving bezel here with a little black stripe that acts as our lubber's line. This allows you to mark your direction of travel and thus see your direction relative to that line. The rotation of that bezel can be locked using this little knob on the side here. And then we have two controls for locking the compass card. This is if you want to lock in a bearing and compare it to some notes or place it on a map. One of them is a little sliding knob on the side, and you have to slide it back in order to release the compass card. And the other is a little button on the side here, which you can just push to temporarily lock the card, and then when you release it, it releases. And if we look on the back of the compass, we'll see that this was manufactured by T. Cook and Sons, which was an instrument maker founded in 1837 by Thomas Cook in the city of York. This particular example was made for the Ontario Hughes Owens Company Limited of Ottawa. And this is likely where it was acquired by the Canadian Army, either in a large batch as an official issue item or as an approved item for private purchase. Now, our second compass that we have here is quite a bit simpler. This is a Short and Mason Magnipole compass, which was a very popular general purpose compass sold on the private market prior to the First World War. As you can see, we don't have any fancy controls on this. We do have a transparent lid with a sighting here. We have a set of luminous radium pointers, and that's about it. It's about as simple as a compass can get. And so this was manufactured by Short and Mason, which was an instrument maker founded in 1864 by Thomas Short and William Mason of London. And they were well known for making a wide variety of instruments, particularly barographs or barometers. So the second type of instrument we have here is what's called a Watkin mirror clinometer, and a clinometer is used for measuring vertical angles. So how this works is that we have an inner ring that rotates inside the case, and it has a graduated angle scale as well as a weight that acts like a pendulum bob. So the ring stays in the same orientation relative to the ground while the case rotates around it. And so how you use this is you look through this little sighting hole here, and you will see two different images side by side. One is just a direct view through this viewport here of whatever it is you're trying to sight, while the other is the reflection of a little concave mirror inside that is giving you a view of the graduated scale on the rotating ring. And the mirror is concave because that magnifies the view and gives you a clearer view of the scale. So you simply sight the object you are trying to measure, and you will see the corresponding angle through the viewpiece. Now, if you rotate this over, it will lock in place for travel so the ring doesn't actually knock about, and you simply release the ring by pushing this little button here, and that releases the lock, and now the ring is loose and can be used. And if we look on the case itself, we'll see that this was made by W.F. Stanley and Company, which was another well-known instrument maker out of London, and this particular type of clinometer was first introduced in the 1880s. Now, going up in sophistication, we get to an instrument that some of you might actually recognize. This is a Heath & Company box sextant, and this was briefly featured in my previous video on sextants and celestial navigation. Now, if you want to get into the nitty-gritty about how these are actually used to determine your position on the Earth, definitely check out that video. In the meantime, however, I'll give a brief description of how a sextant works. So a sextant allows you to determine the angle between 2 points. Now, in a celestial navigation context, this usually means the altitude given as an angle of a celestial body, such as a star or a planet, relative to the horizon. So this is done using a pair of mirrors. You have your index mirror at the top, which tilts back and forth and is connected to this index arm that rides along a graduated scale. And you have your horizon mirror, which is semi-silvered. So when you look through the telescope, you're going to see 2 images side by side. One is the view directly ahead of you, so you usually aim at the horizon, and the other is what is being reflected off of the index mirror. What you do is you capture the object you're trying to measure in the index mirror, and you rotate the index arm until that object is aligned with the horizon. And then you can read the angle between the two off of the scale. You can also use a sextant sideways in order to find the angle between 2 objects on the horizon, which can allow you to determine the range to one of those objects. Now, the reason that the double reflector is used is in order to make the instrument more compact. If you didn't have the double reflector, if you wanted to measure an angle of, say, 90 degrees or 120 degrees, then you would need a scale that is actually 90 degrees or 120 degrees long. By having the double reflector, you can have that. So with a 60-degree scale, which is 1/6 of the circle, hence sextant, you can measure angles of up to 120 degrees. So the Heath box sextant works in exactly the same way, only it has been miniaturized. So it comes in its own self-contained case, which you open by twisting and pulling it apart. The lid comes with a table of natural tangents. You have your index mirror at the top here, which is connected to an index arm on the scale, and this is rotated by turning this knob. And the sighting is made through this little view hole right here, which has a sliding cover to protect it during storage. Now, this little knob on the side here isn't actually a knob, this is a little wrench with a square socket head, and this allows you to adjust these little adjustment screws here to account for various forms of instrument error. Now, the last neat little detail on this sextant is the set of filters. And these are typically used when you're sighting the sun, since the glare coming off the sun can make it difficult to tell whether you have properly aligned the disk of the sun with the horizons. This makes it a lot easier. Now, these are in the deployed position in front of the index mirror, so to retract them, you have to pull aside this little cover here, and then you pull on these levers here to pull out the filters. And we have two of them. We have a green and a red filter. Now, there is some debate as to who actually invented the box sextant, with some crediting the 4th Duke of Gordon, who supposedly invented it around 1813, and others an instrument maker named James Allen, who invented it a couple of years later in the 1820s. What we do know is that this particular unit was manufactured by Heath & Company, which was founded by George Heath in Crayford, London in 1845. Then in 1936, the company was incorporated into W.F. Stanley & Company, which is the company that produced the Watkin mirror clinometer that we just looked at. And finally, we get to our last instrument, which is known as an Abney level. Now, this was invented in the late 1860s by a British astronomer named Sir William Abney, and like the clinometer and the sextant, the purpose of the Abney level is to measure angles. However, unlike the sextant, which allows you to measure the angles between two different points, the Abney level, like the clinometer, measures angles of a target relative to level ground. However, unlike the clinometer, which uses a pendulum as its reference point, this uses a bubble or spirit level. Now, how this works is you have a telescope in one end, pull it out like that. You can adjust the focus by sliding the barrel in and out. And on the other side, you have a 45-degree mirror. And you'll notice that the mirror only takes up half of the barrel, meaning that when you look through the telescope, you will see two images, just like in a sextant. On one side is the clear line of sight to whatever target you're looking at, while on the other side is a reflection on that 45-degree mirror of the bubble level up top. Now, that bubble level is linked to this index arm and can be tilted back and forth with this worm gear by turning the knob at the top. So you'll notice that the barrel is square on this and that the bottom has been finely machined flat. And this is so you can lay this on a flat surface or on top of a Jacob staff, which is a standard piece of equipment for surveyors, though this can also be used handheld. And that is the purpose of this little notch here cut in the side plate. That is to place your middle finger so that you can get a good grip on the instrument. So to use this, you would line up your target with a reference line inside the telescope, and then turn the knob until the image of the bubble is aligned with that reference line. You can then read the angle between level and your target off of the scale here. Now, these were widely used by surveyors and the Forestry Service for all sorts of things, such as doing topographical surveys of areas, determining the heights of trees, conducting geological surveys, you name it. And if you want to learn more about how these were actually used, how to calibrate them and everything like that, in 1914, the U.S. Forestry Service put out a very detailed manual on the subject, and I have included a link to that manual in the description. And finally, one last detail is the manufacturer, which is engraved on the protractor, and that is yet another London-based instrument maker, in this case, J.H. Stewart Limited. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, what makes these instruments even more fascinating is the stories of the people who actually owned and used them during the First World War. And if you look on these leather cases, you'll see that there are two names inscribed, one J.T. Lewis and one T.S. Morrissey. And after doing a little bit of digging online, I was actually able to come across the complete military records of both these individuals. Now, as you can imagine, the name Lewis and the name Morrissey were very common in 1910s Canada, but as luck would have it, only one person on either of those lists matched the profile of a person who actually would have used these instruments. So in the case of J.T. Lewis, there's actually a unit marked on one of the cases here, which is the 2nd Canadian Division Signal Corps. And there was only one J.T. Lewis in the 2nd Canadian Division Signal Corps, and that was one Major John Travers Lewis. And he was born on January 20th, 1891 in Ottawa. I wasn't able to find any pictures of him, but according to his enlistment records, he stood 5 foot 8.5 inches tall and had brown hair and blue eyes. He was an electrical engineer by profession and studied 3 years at the Royal Military College in Kingston, Ontario. He was married to Muriel Grace Lewis, and they lived at 195 Coburg Street in Ottawa. Now, he enlisted on February the 8th, 1915. His enlistment was approved on April 16th of that same year, and he deployed with the 2nd Canadian Division Signal Corps. He shipped out soon after, disembarking at Le Havre in France on September 5th, 1915. The next time his name appears in the records is on January 17th, 1916, when he's granted leave to England, returning on the 25th of January. But very shortly thereafterwards, something very unfortunate happens to him. Near Saint-Éloi in France, he receives a rifle bullet wound to the scrotum and the leg. Ouch. Now, he is initially treated at Boulogne General Hospital before being shipped back to England and hospitalized from March 28th to April 11th, 1916, at Manor House in Folkestone, where he received surgery to remove the bullet. Then, on June 9th, 1916, he was invalided to Canada, traveling aboard the SS Scandinavia. Now, he appears to have recovered well with only minor complications, mainly some lingering pain, but on September 11th, 1916, he was declared unfit for regular service and instead retained at the Signal Training Depot in Ottawa, where he served out the rest of the war as an instructor. He was then discharged on April 15th, 1920. His file also includes a note stating that he died on December 22nd, 1937, at the age of 46. However, I've not been able to find any death certificates or any other records pertaining to Major Lewis, so I've not been able to determine his actual cause of death. But if you are a relative of Major Lewis or know of any records that I can get my hands on, please let me know. I would love to complete his story. Now, when it comes to the second owner of these instruments, T.S. Morrissey, he also turned out to be surprisingly easy to track down. This is because of all the Morrisseys in the Canadian Army at the time, only one of them was in the engineers, and not only that, it was the only one to spell his name with one S rather than two. And this was Major Thomas Sydney Morrisey. Now, he was born on August 30th, 1890 in St. John, New Brunswick. Again, I was not able to find a photograph of him, but according to his enlistment records, he stood 5 foot 10.5 inches tall, had fair hair, and blue eyes. He was also an engineer by profession. He served many years in the Canadian militia, and also studied for 3 years at the Royal Military College. Now, he enlisted on September 23rd, 1914 at Valcartier, Quebec, and was mobilized with the 5th Regiment Royal Highlanders of Canada as a captain. He embarked for England on October 4th, 1914, and after a period of training, embarked for France on February 9th, 1915. Now, Morrissey actually had quite the illustrious military career, being assigned as staff captain and other leading roles at various headquarters throughout the front, including 13th Battalion, 3rd Canadian Infantry Brigade, 8th Canadian Infantry Brigade, and the 1st Quebec Regimental Depot. And on September 19, 1918, he was sent to Vladivostok as part of the Canadian Expeditionary Force in Siberia. This is part of a larger Allied operation to support the White Russians in their fight against the Bolsheviks during the ongoing Russian Civil War. However, very shortly after arriving in March 1919, he was diagnosed with anemia and general debility and invalided back to Canada, being discharged shortly after his arrival on April 24th, 1919. Now, at some point following his discharge, he married one Beatrice Morrissey, and they settled together in Montreal, and he died on May 20th, 1975, at the age of 85. Now, in addition to details of his deployment and his medical records, his records also include an extensive list of the awards that he received during his service, including General Service Order 3rd Grade, awarded on January 15th, 1916, Distinguished Service Order, awarded June 3rd, 1916, General Service Order 2nd Grade, awarded October 30th, 1917, mentioned in dispatches on December 28, 1917, General Service Order 1st Grade, awarded on September 19, 1918. On August 21, 1921, he was awarded the Order of the Rising Sun by the Empire of Japan, and on December 1, 1921, he was awarded the Czechoslovak War Cross. Like I said, a very distinguished military career. Now, the cherry on top here when it comes to putting this whole story together is the fact that Major Morrissey lived in Montreal, because the aunt who sent me these instruments when I was 8 years old also lived in Montreal. So while this is a bit of speculation, what likely happened here is that Major Lewis owned these instruments first and then either left them at the front or in England or at the training depot in Ottawa when he was invalided, where they were then picked up by Major Morrissey, who brought them home to Montreal when he was discharged. They then remained in Montreal in the antique circuit until they were acquired by my aunt, who then sent them to me. And when it comes to building a story for an artifact using scattered pieces of information, it really doesn't get much sweeter than that, and it adds a whole fascinating dimension to these already fascinating objects. Now, one thing I have to mention here is that one of these instruments does not belong to either Lewis or Morrissey, and that's the Abney level, which actually belonged to one Herbert Irving Stevenson, whose name you might recall because he was also the owner of the Ulster Galilean sites that we looked at in a previous video. And just to give you a short rundown of his career, he was born on July 17, 1878 in Richibucto, New Brunswick, and enlisted as a private in the Royal Canadian Dragoons. Now, he served in the Boer War, earning the Queen's Medal with 5 clasps. Upon his return, he worked as a naval architect in Baltimore for a few years before returning to Canada in 1903, whereupon he worked a number of jobs, including as a farmer, as the manager of a laundry, and for a lumber company, before joining the Dominion Forestry Service in 1912. Now, on the outbreak of the First World War, he was recalled to duty and placed in command of the 1st Canadian Mounted Rifles, but then transferred over to the Fort Garry Horse. During the war, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Order with 2 bars for distinguished conduct, and on his return to Canada, he returned to forestry and eventually rose to the directorship of the Forestry Department in Manitoba, a position he would hold until he retired in June 1924. He then died a year later on September 1st, 1943. Anyway, that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching, and I really hope that you enjoyed as much as I did going through not only the mechanics of these objects, but also the human stories associated with them. It was just so exhilarating for me to be able to actually find these military records and finally put a face, or at least a history, to the names that are inscribed on these cases and connect these objects to all the people who interacted with them during the First World War. It was a really unique experience and not one that many of us get to have. Now, I'll see you next time on another episode where we'll look at yet more objects and stories just like this one. Until then, I'm Jean Messier from Our Own Devices. Have a great day.